How's it going, everybody? Gene here from Entropy & Sons, back with another tutorial video for our synth, the Recursion Studio. In this video, we're going to start diving into the modulation system, which is definitely the most advanced part of the synth. This isn't going to be a full overview of the system, but it's probably, if you really want to do some interesting and cool stuff with the synth, this is where you need to start learning and what you need to start, kind of trying to wrap your head around. So to get started, we have power plugged into the synth and video. We also have an audio cable plugged in, and for this video we have a video camera plugged in as well. And as always, our synth is updated to the most recent version of the software. So let's get started here. So the modulation system is definitely special. Every single instrument has a modulation module, and it definitely functions in a bit of a different way than the other modules. So first of all, let's dive into the modulation module. The modulation module has 4 submodules corresponding to 4 different channels. All right. I don't know if you guys know this. First of all, because there's a little arrow right here, that means the shift button shows you more actions. Every single module has a preview function. What the preview function does is it lets you view the module's output completely in isolation. You can go into like the color module and preview it, and you get some idea of what the color module is actually doing. Let's go into the lighting module, it's a little more obvious. So this gives you some idea of how the lighting module is behaving. This will give you some idea of how the recurse module is behaving. And this will give you some idea of how the modulation module is behaving. So what the modulation module does is it generates 4 one-dimensional patterns. All right, right now, it's just 4 basic patterns, they're all identical. These colors don't actually mean anything. They're just a way to differentiate the 4 patterns. So they're all one-dimensional. They all have a value of 1 in the middle. They kind of go to 0, then they go to 1, and then they go to 0 as you go out from the center. And what you can do with these patterns is you can modulate parameters. So there's a parameter right here called hue offset. And what that one does is it just rotates the color of the final image around the color wheel. So if it's 0, the colors are going to stay the same. If it is 0.3, that moves all the colors 33% around the color wheel. So red goes to green, green goes to blue, blue goes to red. All right? And you see that it's doing this uniformly across the entire image. All reds go to green, all greens go to blue, and so forth. All right, we can tap on the parameter and we can modulate it. We can use any of these 4 modulation patterns that I just showed you to modulate the parameter. Actually, let's go and before we do that, let's actually change the modulation a little bit. So instead of identical patterns, we'll put a square in here, and it's not going to do anything visible because nothing is being modulated yet. We'll put some lines here, and we'll put this pattern here. So now we have these 4 patterns loaded in these 4 modulation channels. All right. Now, this should be obvious what it's doing. So you go to a parameter, and then you start modulating it. And now its parameter is going to change over space. So instead of having a solid value, the value of this parameter is changing based on this circular pattern right here. All right. We can use the second modulation pattern, which was those squares. So now we're using this modulation pattern to modulate the parameter. So it makes a parameter's value change over space. So instead of having the exact same value of some value from 0 to 1, the value varies across space. All right, so here's the 4 patterns: circle, square, lines, that radial pattern. You go to the modulation module, you see those are exactly the patterns we generated. See this, and this one's using the yellow one that's being covered up by the video of the screen. So that's the basic idea behind the modulation system, and the idea can definitely be used in other places too. So pretty much any parameter can be modulated by the modulation system. So now we see that it's affecting this parameter based on those patterns we generated. It can get really wild if you start doing some of the other parameters, like this one right here. It's going to selectively add transparency. So this is the alpha control, which blends between layers. and the blending value now depends on these patterns that we just generated. So now it's that square, now it's the horizontal lines. So this is really where things start getting incredibly interesting with the synth. There's also these three additional methods right here. You don't really need to understand what those are doing. You just kind of play around with them. They're basically just formulas. One other thing to know, so we have an alpha parameter right here. We can change the value. Now it's 0, now it's all the way to 1. When you modulate a parameter, the control no longer affects the parameter. It affects the amount of modulation that's applied. So if the value's all the way at 1, that's full modulation. If it's down to 0, then it's no modulation. And that's relevant for these other equations here. So yeah, it actually looks kind of cool. We can go to the width parameter, modulate it here, and now we get something really strange. See that? Starts to look kind of awesome. So like I said, this is the first video about the modulation system. I'll almost certainly be doing additional ones because it is fairly advanced, but the power is enormous. You can start modulating parameters that are used to generate the modulation parameters. You can do recursion with the modulation system. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can warp into the modulation channel right here, and you can actually see what the modulation pattern is made from. You can generate modulation patterns based on things that are plugged in. Like I have a camera plugged in, and I think we're using this modulation pattern right now. Let's load one that uses the video. So some of them come with audio reactivity. Actually, let's just do this. This is loaded from the audio reactivity. So now this is being generated by the audio input. So we can actually preview this modulation pattern, and you see the one in the upper right corner is actually being generated by the audio reactivity of the synth. Let's change this right here, and now go into here. Now the color is being cycled based on the audio reactivity, or the audio input from the synth. You can do a similar thing with a video input. So we have a camera plugged in, and now it's using the camera input to cycle the colors of the synth. All right. So hopefully this makes sense. I know it's a little unusual and definitely fairly advanced, but this is really where the synth starts getting really interesting. Like all of the really advanced and like cool stuff that you see in a lot of the preset library comes from the modulation system. The vast majority of the synth's audio and video reactivity comes from the modulation system. So this is definitely the stuff you want to learn. If you're totally lost, I suggest watching the create overview video and the parameter overview video, the video on modules and instruments, because you need a decent understanding of that stuff in order to wrap your head around this stuff too. But anyways, there will be some more videos on this, but hopefully this will work as a solid introduction to the system. All right, stay tuned for the next video where we'll go over I/O mappings and the mapping system of the synth. All right, thanks a lot.